that President Trump is proposing would not improve U.S. security. It would worsen it. The basic idea of President Trump's national security strategy is, we're so powerful, we can dictate terms. We should not be limited by quaint things like the United Nations or treaties or even normal relations with other countries. And within our own hemisphere, we're absolutely dominant. And we can tell the countries in our hemisphere what to do or not to do. And as we see in the case of Venezuela, we can threaten them, amass troops, perhaps overthrow a government with impunity. So the idea of the national security strategy is that the United States is the most powerful country in the world, and should remain so. And by dint of being the most powerful country in the world, it remains strong by dictating the terms to other countries. This reveals a mindset where power replaces restraint and dominance replaces diplomacy. The problem is, intimidation creates obedience, not loyalty, and history is clear. When rules are ignored and force becomes the language, power doesn't expand. It overextends. Well, my critique is that this is all a bit of a delusion. We are not all powerful. In fact, what is clearly evident in the case of the Ukraine war is that the United States could not dictate, though it tried to for 30 years, the expansion of NATO to Russia's border. Russia said, no, it came to blows. It's not going to happen. This shatters the myth of total control. Ukraine proved that U.S. power has limits. You can push alliances forward, but you can't force outcomes forever. When a major power says no, reality eventually wins. The United States cannot dictate terms in other parts of the world either. We can keep ourselves safe. We should deal with other countries in a mutually respectful way in order to enhance our security. And we should drop the delusions that we can overthrow governments at will, or tell the Latin American countries you can't deal with China, for example, another subject of this strategy, because all of that is arrogance that's going to lead to a downfall, not the kind of prudence that leads to real security. This is the core mistake, confusing arrogance with security. The U.S. can protect itself, but it can't run the world. Real security comes from restraint and mutual respect, not from trying to dictate who other nations trade with or overthrowing governments on impulse. History punishes hubris far more reliably than it rewards force. The Monroe Doctrine is usually dated in short orthand, as the United States is in charge of the Western Hemisphere, in some sense. But what President Monroe said when he sent his seventh message to the Congress in 1823 is three stipulations. First, and this was in the aftermath of the wars of independence of the other countries of the Americas, that the newly independent countries of the Americas, who had gained independence from the Spanish Empire or the Portuguese Empire, that Europe should not reclaim those colonies. In other words, the era of European colonization or empire building in the Americas was over. Second, that the Europeans should not introduce their military into the Americas. And third, which is almost entirely forgotten in our time, is the reciprocity that the United States under the Monroe Doctrine declares. We will not interfere in Europe's wars and in Europe's security. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't about control. It was about restraint. Europe stayed out of the Americas, and the U.S. stayed out of Europe's wars, forgetting that balance turned a defensive idea into a tool for overreach. So the Monroe Doctrine was actually stated in 1823 as a reciprocal doctrine. You stay out of our backyard, and we'll stay out of yours when it comes to military and security issues. Don't threaten us. We won't get involved in how did we get 850 military installations in 80 countries around the world. Well, because we are not very good at reciprocity. We are very good at telling other countries what to do, but not actually behaving according to the rules. This exposes the contradiction. The Monroe Doctrine was built on reciprocity, mutual restraint. But 850 bases across 80 countries show how far the U.S. drifted from that principle. Demanding rules for others while ignoring them yourself isn't leadership. It's overreach that we have set on others. In other words, do not do unto others in the way that we dictate to them what they should do to us. we say, stay out of our hemisphere. Don't even come close. Don't dream of threatening us anywhere in the Americas. But if we want to have a military base in Ukraine, that's none of Russia's business. If we want to arm Taiwan, a part of China, that's none of China's business. In other words, we can say, oh, don't even come within thousands of miles. Don't even have a port servicing operation in Panama by a Hong Kong company. That's a threat to the United States. But we can have 750 or 800 military bases in around 80 countries of the world on anyone's borders without anyone telling us what to do. So the idea of the Golden Rule does not apply under the U.S. rubric. Now this lays bare the double standard. The U.S. demands absolute security in its own hemisphere, yet dismisses Russian or Chinese concerns as irrelevant. Bases near their borders are called stability, while a foreign port near ours is labeled a threat. When the Golden Rule only runs one way, it stops being security policy and becomes entitlement. What happened is, again, the U.S. has a particular history. It has been an imperial power from the start, but for the first hundreds of years, the empire building was on the North American continent. It was on defeating Native American populations, or attacking the Mexican government and Mexican territory to wrest a lot of the southwest of the United States, California for the United States, and so forth. That empire building of the United States lasted through the 19th century. This reminds us that U.S. power didn't begin overseas. It was built through continental expansion against native populations and neighboring states like Mexico. The habit of empire formed early, and once expansion becomes normal, it doesn't easily stop. It just changes geography. It ended around 1890, and then, immediately, the United States said, okay, now we build an international empire. And it toppled the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1890s, and then in 1898, on very dubious grounds, went to war with the very weak and failing Spanish Empire and captured the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. This is the pivot point. Once continental expansion ended, the U.S. simply exported empire overseas, starting with Hawaii, then the Spanish-American War. The pattern didn't change, only the map did, and that mindset still shapes policy today, and basically held on to those territories. Cuba technically gained independence, but under something called the Platt Amendment, the United States asserted its right to intervene at will in Cuban affairs for decades afterwards. And that's why we still have a patch of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, where that naval base, that base and prison, is held until this day. That came from the conquests of the United States in 1898. Soon after the Spanish-American War victory, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a real imperialist after all, declared his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, something very different. He said not only should Europe stay away, but he also said that the U.S. would be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere quite explicitly, that we could go in to clean up bad behavior. One of the reasons, interestingly, why he said it is that Venezuela, of all countries, because we're at it again, in 1902 defaulted on its foreign debt, and the British and the French actually shelled the harbor of Caracas to get the Venezuelans to restart their debt payments. So Teddy Roosevelt said, we'll take care of that problem, not the Europeans. We'll be the policemen of our own hemisphere. But the Roosevelt corollary became a license for the Marines landing wherever they wanted in Central America, in Cuba, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in repeated military interventions and regime change operations. This is where restraint fully disappears. What began as a limited doctrine turned into open policing of an entire hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary wasn't defensive. It was a permission slip for intervention, occupations, and regime change. From Cuba to Haiti, power justified itself by claiming order. But what it really entrenched was the idea that force, not consent, was the natural tool of U.S. policy. Overthrowing governments, this led to a lot of instability. And when the sixth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt gained the White House, Franklin Roosevelt, and H came into the White House on March 4, 1933, he declared a good neighbor policy. He repudiated his distant cousin's corollary, and he said, "We will not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries in our hemisphere." And that was a principle that Roosevelt held to. And then it became part of a charter, the Charter of the Organization of American States, which was adopted in 1948, which says explicitly in part of the Charter Article 19, no country should interfere in the internal affairs of other countries in the hemisphere. This was a rare turn toward restraint. Franklin D. Roosevelt rejected intervention, arguing it created instability, not security. That principle was later written into the Organization of American States, a rule we've repeatedly ignored since. Well, along comes Donald Trump. His corollary is, the Roosevelt corollary, 10 times over. But it says not only are we the policemen, not only can we boss other countries around, but it's not only military issues where we're the policemen. We can tell other countries, you make contracts only with American companies, and you do not make contracts or trade or investments with countries we don't like. This is the Roosevelt corollary.
Amplified, a policing not just security, but trade itself. Telling countries who they can do business with isn't leadership, it's coercion, and it invites resistance. Subtext, China. So Trump is amping it up, telling other countries, we're going to run the whole show of our hemisphere. And this military buildup and killing people in boats off the coast of Venezuela is the application of what is called the Trump corollary. It's a lot of hubris. It's a lot of arrogance. It doesn't sit well with the rest of the world, and it's not going to work because it's a huge exaggeration of American power. This is the Trump corollary in action. Exaggerated power, zero restraint, framed as strength. It's really hubris. Trying to dominate a hemisphere, dictate trade, and enforce order through force doesn't command respect. It provokes resistance. And history is clear. When power overestimates itself, the collapse begins quietly, then all at once.